Not academic, this is not theory, this is based on personal experience. I grew up in Indiana, small farm town, family of 10 children. I was the only one planned. I was the fifth child. Mom and Dad, people would ask my mom whether they're Catholic, and then she said, yep, no sense of rhythm at all. And we're, a really tight-knit family, farming, factories, hardworking. All 10 of our children, we put ourselves through college, several doctorate degrees, and a lot of love. And after college, I went off to the Peace Corps to Sierra Leone. And I took that love for my family and I transferred that to families in Cagberry and Masongbo, two small villages, both of them 30 houses, about 300 people. A.K. Sisse and his wife Tandy and their daughters, and then the other village, the Conte brothers. And the people there were subsistent farmers who lived on less than $1 a day, and they opened their hearts, they opened their homes, and they took me in, and I just fell in love with them. And without electricity and running water, suddenly life became different because everything was ruled by the rhythms of daily life. The rhythms of the rainy season, dry season, the rhythms of the moon. When it was rainy season and there was a new moon, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. On the nights of a full moon, in the dry season, there would be so much village electricity, light, that children would walk around and play until the wee hours of the morning. There were the rhythms of the crops in hungry season when there wasn't much to eat and yet you had to work really hard in the fields. And then harvest season when there was an abundance which coincided with holidays and there was this joyous festivity. Then there was also rhythms of manhood and adulthood when young kids young would be taken into the bush and initiated in these secret societies, ancient secret societies of spirituality that coexisted with Islam and Christianity. And I would hear the drumming in the bush and the chanting, and I was like, my God, these people are connected. They're connected with their families, their community, their environment, and these kids were learning about the relationship with the ancestors and the spirits in the bush. And something started to work on me slowly over time. Granted, I was doing some work, and I stumbled into some great projects, water wells, and making fishing lures, catching hundreds of pounds of fish, but that was secondary to the transformation that was happening. And it wasn't until, and this isn't romanticized because 1 in every 4 or 5 children would die before the age of 5. And yet there still was a sense of connectedness and belonging that I just ached for it. And that was really kind of the wake-up call, the spiritual awakening for me. Because when I came back to the United States, the culture shock was overwhelming. Why are people in a hurry? What is this pursuit of happiness? For 4 years I lived without media except for maybe a little shortwave radio. Didn't hear Indiana basketball team winning the national championship at 3 in the morning in a small bush village. I was the only one celebrating. But then I suddenly became aware of all the media we have here, and the billboards and the advertisements. In order to be happy, I must look a certain way. I must have certain possessions. In order to avoid calamity and all this fear, I must buy this and that and this. And then suddenly I need more money, I must go out there and get this. And then I was like sitting around, like, we're not spending as much time connecting with one another as my friends in the village were. And then something happened while I was gone too. We went from 3 TV stations to cable television. And then the level of violence, it was like taking a frog and put it in cold water. It's a terrible metaphor. It's the way you cook a frog. You put it in cold water and turn up the heat slowly, and so it doesn't realize that it's slowly going to burn. And that's what happened. Because I'd go home and my parents were watching TV, and they'd be watching shows, and suddenly someone would be shot and killed. I would flinch. I was like, oh my God, that person's dead. What about their family? And everyone was like, well, that was entertaining. It's like, what in the world is going on here? So I was furious. I was angry. I was just really upset because I also knew this lifestyle we had here of pursuing happiness through massive consumerism was impacting people back in Sierra Leone. How many people here ever donate clothes to Goodwill and Salvation Army? I do it too. Did you know they can't sell all that clothes and it gets dumped on the markets in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and all across the world? local textiles, companies can't compete with it. So when we get upset and we're moved, well, I think I'll go shopping, I'll buy this, boom. T-shirts end up deep in the bush of Sierra Leone. I've seen a man deep in the bush, an elderly man, wearing a shirt that says, "Baby on board." You know, there's this weird humor and it's bizarre, and yet the global economy is being driven by a few 100 million people pursuing happiness outside of themselves. That is a spiritual crisis. That is a spiritual crisis that is dramatically impacting the environment and impacting Sierra Leone. And this impact drove me to start seeking. And you know, I met one of the first people I met coming back was a yogi, Michael Singer, and the author of Untitled Soul. And this led on a spiritual journey where I started meditating, you know, 2 hours a day for the last 22 years of meditation, really going in and looking for this relationship between inner peace and international peace. Spent some time on the Navajo reservation, went to Washington, D.C., started working on peace-building projects. Mickey Singer, the yogi, said, you know, who asked you how it should be? And which pissed me off, excuse me, because, I mean, people are dying. It's like, who asked you how it should be? He said, there are billions of stars in the galaxy, billions of galaxies. There is an intelligence guiding that. And if you turn to that intelligence, it will guide your life in ways you never imagined. It could take you back to Africa in ways you wouldn't imagine. Well, I did go back to Sierra Leone. I did go back on an assessment mission during the war. I got to go back to see some of the friends, hear the horror stories, hearing about how people with less than $1 a day were impacted by a war that was being driven by the global economy. This war had started 2 years after I left Sierra Leone. And I got to see firsthand some of the death and destruction. That pretty much was a shock to the system, because I didn't know how I could meditate and find peace when this was going on. And I was seeing how the war in Sierra Leone was impacting my loved ones. So I went deeper into meditation, and I did something in the tradition that I knew to do, is I threw myself at the feet of the Divine Mother, and I just started praying for Mother to reveal herself. And just with all my heart going into meditation, like, Mother, how can you allow 8-year-old boys to carry AK-47s? And as I started to do this, experiences started to happen. Experiences of profound, deep love, ecstatic love, the type that Rumi writes about. There would be times where I'd be so overwhelmed with love, it would just go on and on. The closest thing I could describe it to would be just waves of energy shooting through the body. And then I got to go back, and in the book I have some of the love poetry that was writing about at the time. And then I got to go back to Sierra Leone again during the war, going in and out of these ecstatic states of love, and then going back and seeing the deadly conflict. And I was trying for all of my life is how to bridge this deep inner spiritual aspect, this communion and love affair with the Divine Mother, with children who had killed and raped some of my friends in the villages. That is what I was trying to bridge. And luckily I had mentors along the way, and luckily also I started to see, I was able to work on peace-building missions with Search for Common Ground, an organization that's one of the world-leading transformation organizations on dealing with societal conflict. And so luckily, by working with them, I mean, we were working on entire societies of transforming through media, radio, and television. By doing this, I started to see a bridge between the inner and the international. The first thing I started to see is that inner peace is a global responsibility. The weapons in Sierra Leone, AK-47s and others, were purchased with blood diamonds and illegal timber trade that was going into the Western consumerist market. Inner peace is a global responsibility. It's a responsibility of every spiritual tradition to be able to take a person into help guide a person to find his or her own personal relationship with God, Spirit, whatever you want to call it. The second thing I started to see is that conflict is an absolutely natural part of the human experience and a natural part of a spiritual path. On one level, it's a matter of differences that we coincide. But if you take it a little bit deeper, drawing upon the Buddhist tradition, Tara Brach says, we have our thoughts and we have our emotions and we identify with them. And what this does, it leads to, let me back up a second. The way she was saying is that we feel separate from Source. And that sense of separation leads to the wanting self. I want to be happy and I want to avoid suffering. And we go around trying to rearrange the world to get it the way we want it. And inevitably, we bump into another. Einstein said it the same thing. Same thing. It's like we're part of the universe, but we have this optical delusion where we believe our thoughts and emotion, we believe we're separate from it. That sense of separation, the separation between ego and soul, or spirit and source, is the source of conflict. And all of us have this conflict going on inside of us. We're trying to rearrange the world to get it the way we want it, with a world that's constantly changing. So conflict is natural. And once accepting conflict as natural, then it becomes an opportunity. Do I engage in it in a constructive way that can bridge separation, or do I go down a destructive path? The work of Search for Common Ground was applying deeply held spiritual principles to transform deadly conflict. Within a year of the genocide in Rwanda, our programs had Hutus and Tutsis co-producing radio programs. One of the radio programs was about a soap opera called Our Neighbors, Ourselves. The idea was to rehumanize the other. Because when there's a conflict, what happens is fear helps us. What happens when there's fear is we narrow our identity down to one. I'm Hutu, Tutsi, Democrat, Republican, Muslim, Christian, Jew. And when we get down to that place of only one identity, we confuse the problem with the other. It could be economic, it could be education. No, the problem is the Republicans or the Democrats. The problem is the Christians or the Jew. And so we stereotype, we demonize, and dehumanize. How many people here have ever made fun of a political figure? We all do it. It's a slippery slope, because when we go down that slippery slope, then the way we overcome the conflict is we attack the other. Rwanda, classic example. Nazi Germany, Cambodia, Democrats and Republicans in Capitol Hill. We all do it. It's a slippery slope. It's a spiritual discipline to learn how to rehumanize the other. So what I've seen is that there is a wave of peace building arising around the world. I've met hundreds of peace builders across Sub-Saharan Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Angola, Nigeria, Guinea. I've met peace builders up in Nepal, in India, Macedonia with this work. All of these people are giving rise to the spirit of humanity that are taking the deeply held spiritual principles of all traditions and applying them in creative ways. Kimmy Weeks in Liberia at the age of 9 was thrown onto a mass grave in a refugee camp because they thought he was dead. When his mother found him, he looked in her eyes and he promised he would dedicate his life to helping children never having to experience this again. He went on at the age of 16 to produce a radio program that's now been replicated in over 20 countries. A radio program where young kids are given a voice to peace. That is the spirit of peace. It is arising everywhere in the world. And it's rising from the inner to the international. We are sitting at a time in humanity where there's been this wave building the past few decades in every sector of society. And with the job I have now with the Summer of Peace, what we've been doing is starting to interview people. The last 2 summers, we've interviewed over 180 people. Next screen, Dan. Thank you. And 180 people purposely, intentionally starting to map out peace from the inner to international. From 15 different sectors of society. We've interviewed people who are working on education, communication, business, science. We've also interviewed people from the military. Some of the leading thinking on climate change and peace building is coming from the Pentagon. So we've been interviewing these people with the intention of showing that the peace movement today is in a similar place the environment was in the 60s. A lot of individual initiatives rising up, not aware that there's a larger movement. And this movement today is different than the 60s. It's not anti-war. It is, how are we going to create a way of living together in right relationship, being the peace while working on peace? How are we going to create the systems that are going to change this mindless consumerism? And in having the privilege of having interviewed over 120 of these people myself, including Pete Carroll, the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, Meta Violence, Michael Nagler interviewed Meta World Peace from the LA Lakers. Meta World Peace talked about his struggle of inner peace and interpersonal and how to handle anger. And he said a technique that he did was to come back to his breath. Cynthia Bourgeois, a Christian mystic, a few days later said the same thing. Chief Phil Lane Jr., we've been working closely with him with creating indigenous summits, looking at the reunion of the condor and the eagle, these 500-year-old prophecies, talks about how we're all part of a web of life. Colonel Puck Mickleby from the Marine Corps, while on detail at the Pentagon, was asked to create a new grand strategy for America. He came out with a new narrative saying that we're interdependent, interconnected today like never before. Our national priority is sustainability. We need to invest more in renewable energies and education. We need to have a foreign policy that's focused on credibility based on our values, not dominance, threat, and response. While viewing this all across the world and taking this into a couple hours of meditation today, the fingerprints are clear. It is the spirit of humanity that's rising up. And when we go through the dark nights of the soul, when the ego gets shattered time and time again by not getting what we think we need in order to be happy, who's there waiting for us? The witness, the soul. When we get on our knees and we cry to the Divine Mother or Christ or Krishna, and we start to surrender, what that spirit does, it starts to use us in ways we never ever imagined. And we start to strive to embody that and to bring it into every interaction. And then we find that we're a droplet in a larger wave that's emerging. Let's go to the next couple. Thank you. A friend of mine, David Nichol, did his PhD research in subtle activism, how prayer and meditation actually affects social change. The last 2 years, we've organized a series called Spirituality and Peace, where every Sunday we would have people from different spiritual traditions leading meditation. The intention was to work on the subtle planes, where we bring in the power of those different spiritual traditions to tap into the invisible resources that are there, to start creating a field of collective consciousness where that spiritual power could arise. Last year, David said, I've got an idea. Why don't we do synchronized global meditations on International Day of Peace? This was an example of a man who deeply believed in the power of spirit, deeply believed that we're all part of this collective consciousness. He reached out to a few people, and within days he had dozens of organizations saying, yes, we'll participate. Last year they had 248 cities around the world collaborating in synchronized global meditations. This is happening. There's an exponential growth. Meditation, prayer, nonviolent communication, peace education. There's so many ways. There's a new narrative of peace that's arising from the inner to the international. There's a quote I want to read from Steve Killalea, who created the Global Peace Index. And then I want to close with a video of Be the Peace. Steve Killalea is documenting scientifically the most peaceful countries in the world and the economic impact of peace and lack of peace. And in an interview, he said Sanskrit has, well, I'm paraphrasing, I had a couple lines here. He said, Sanskrit has 108 words for love, Islam has 99 names for God, Japanese has 14 words for beauty. We've got one word for peace. We don't have enough words to accurately describe all the different types of peace. I think it was Socrates who once said, if you don't have a word to describe something, then how can you think about it? That's why we've been mapping out peace from the inner to international. That's why we've been sharing the stories of Pete Carroll and Cynthia Bourgeois, Kimmy Weeks, and others, so we can bring attention to the fact that there's a lot of different ways of expressing peace in this world.
So the task is to come forth with a question that's in your heart, and then Dan will be coming around with the microphone so that those of you who want to ask Phillip will be able to do that.
The question from our table is, living in the American, where we live, how do we go about breaking our addiction to consumerism, knowing that it is a global problem?
I just want to acknowledge that we're all co-mentors here of one another, that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom with each of us, and also to acknowledge the solutions to problems of the world today are coming through a collaborative process. I'll just share what my experience is to these questions. That is one that hits home for me, because my dad worked in a factory that was on the verge of closing frequently, and with 10 kids there was often some stress about the economic security. And I remember once when he lost a job prior to that coming home, we're all like, oh my God, you know, he was selling insurance at the time before going to the factory that was on the verge of closing. So I've struggled with this one because it seems like there is a secure, you know, I've seen impact of countries without a financial system, you know, Sierra Leone and so forth. So it's like, how can we participate in a transformation of an economic system that's based on all of us being in a place of unhappiness to get things, to one that is more rooted locally and sustainable. In some of the programs we've interviewed David Corton, and David Corton is really good at keeping a bird's eye view of what's emerging in this area. And there's quite a bit of initiatives looking at local economies and so forth. You know, I'm sure Eugene has a lot with the local agriculture and so forth. So I think looking locally, reinforcing, educating oneself, go to David Corton's work and others, see what's emerging. And then I think the other part is just internally, just checking. You know, am I restless? Am I just going to go out and distract myself with something? Particularly supporting the industry of violent films, you know, because what people don't realize is that the last decade, thousands of video parlors have popped up across sub-Saharan Africa where for pennies, young children are watching violent movies. I forgot to mention one of the villages I lived in was sacked by a rebel unit headed by a teenage boy named Colonel Rambo, who was trained by watching Rambo movies. So when we support this industry, I mean, there are thousands and thousands, of these video parlors for young kids just going to watch for pennies these violent films, not knowing the difference. So it's how we spend our money also is voting on what we want to see in the world. I tend to like to support the local businesses as much as I can, and have relationship with people. And that's a big question, and I think we're in for some crises which will lead to transformation.
David Corton, Korten, The Great Turning, I think was his book, wasn't it, right?
Yeah.
What we'd like to hear is what signs of hope you see, and what kind of, what will keep us going and inspired and moving on.
That dance between hope and despair is where the fate of humanity hangs. And each of us on a daily basis battle with that. And I've battled with that quite a bit. And there's several answers for this. A is having a deep spiritual practice on a daily basis, because that's ultimately the source of connection. And being able to take anything, even the anger or frustration, taking it, laying it at the feet of God or Spirit, whatever, and just going in and starting to tap into that wellspring that is there. The second thing is to start looking and finding places that highlight the positive. I mean, the summerofpeace.net, there's interviews of 180 people that's available to listen to for free online. If you want to download them, we charge a little bit in order to keep the lights on. But the intention there was to start bringing a positive focus to the ways, the concrete, practical ways of transforming difficult situations. And I mean, this isn't Pollyanna either. I mean, I've interviewed William Killebrew, who witnessed his mother and brother murdered, and now he's working on gun violence. I interviewed a woman whose mother has been in prison for 20 years, and she's working on restorative justice. By listening to these stories, particularly the ones of people going through challenges like that, you can start to see a pattern of, yes, we can go through the dark nights, and yes, we can get to a place of rising up. The other thing too, by looking at these examples, you start to see who's doing what and what resonates with me, because each of us have a different gifts to be offering, and what I'm offering is going to be different than someone else's. And everything, whether big or small, is important. And so by looking at this plethora of different peace building, again, all these different sectors of society, you can say, hey, I'm interested in education. Or, I'm interested in how businesses can be used. Or I'm interested in working in nonviolence and forgiveness. And so that's what I would recommend. That's one resource, and there's so many resources right now. And so it's a part of it is being proactive and educating oneself and looking for the positive, inspirational stories. And then moving from deep inner practice to action. That was a question that came up at our table. And that's a really important one. To me, there's no difference between meditation and daily action. The daily meditation anchors into an awareness of the witness and a source that is much bigger than what my mind can comprehend. And when we have that witness, this is going into another question, is what that does, it allows us to witness our reactions before we react. So we can observe, witness our thoughts, witness our emotions. We go into that place where we go into a meditation, we feel that peace, that taps into a wisdom, you will, of a higher wisdom, and then we can respond. And so I think that is where meditation meets the road on daily life. Just every interaction, how can I respond from the place of my deepest peace to whatever's happening? And then that information will then guide us into other actions we need to take in the world. So again, educate what's out there, do the daily practice, and then follow the energy. Follow the energy where it wants to take you.
Can you identify 2 or 3 specific peace practices which you've seen elsewhere people engage in that would help lead us from develop our own internal peace in interacting with others, and then peace in organizations that work in the community? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to describe one that we can do in daily life, and then I'll mention 2 different ways it's been applied on the international level. It's called the Namaste practice, or Hello Love. Briefly, there was a man in Tibet, and the story is more detailed in my book, but basically he encountered a situation that angered him with a Buddhist monastery being closed by Tibetan Chinese guards, and then he met a family that met the same situation, and he started talking to a young girl in the family. They were exchanging words, English for Tibetan, and she taught him Namaste. I honor the spirit in you that's also in me. And she asked him, well, how do you say that in English? And he realized he didn't have a way. And he also realized that when he said hello to people, he would say, oh, hi, how are you? And he'd walk on. And so what he started to do, and this is a corporate consultant, does trainings, he started to stop and inside would acknowledge the spirit in the other person that's also in him. He would acknowledge the humanity in the other. He noticed that the relationships in the offices started to change, that there was more trust. And that trust serves as a foundation for deeper relationships. In Sierra Leone, after the war, there were thousands of child soldiers. Children were used to manipulate elections, do horrendous crimes, and particularly homeless children. And so the radio program we had went out and interviewed these young kids, acknowledging their humanity. Put the radio program on the air about what their experience was being manipulated by politicians to do violence, but never coming through with the promises. The children heard their voices on the radio, and then our staff went back to them and said, "What would you like to do?" They had this sense of self-worth. They're like, "Well, we'd like to be election monitors." Instead of doing violence during elections, I mean, this was horrendous violence. They became election monitors. And then they enrolled people to register, and it would turn out to be one of the safest elections in Sierra Leone's history. Combine that with other initiatives with radio. Iran, okay, so that's one example. Iran and U.S., my colleagues at Search for Common Ground had been hosting secret dialogues, or not so secret anymore, at the time they were secret, between Iranian diplomats and U.S. diplomats, former ones. And in the first meeting, in a room like this, they didn't know whether to put wine on the table or assign seating. And Susan Collin Marks, God, I love this woman. She's an incredible peace builder from South Africa. And what she did is she had everybody introduce themselves by talking about their family. And so everyone heard these people having loved ones and children. And the tone in the room changed. It shifted. They started to see the humanity in the other. After several dialogues with the Iranians, that they said, and the Iranian U.S. ambassador, they said it's time for the U.S. to go back to Iran. No one had been back there since the hostage crisis. And they said, "We can't go back there." They said, "Your diplomats can't, but your wrestling team can." Poets and wrestlers are heroes in Iran. The wrestling team said yes, they would go. It wasn't the world championship wrestling, it was the amateurs, the real ones. And they didn't know whether to take the U.S. flag. And when they walked into the gymnasium in Tehran carrying the U.S. flag, they got a standing ovation. And what these stories show is that all of us really deeply inside want to be connected. And it really starts on a daily basis at the checkout line at the grocery store, at work, strangers on the street. And that opens up the best of our humanity. So that's a practice.
All this sounds wonderful. Is it a way of simply, though, changing the order of the chairs on the Titanic?
No.
And many of us here agree with each other. So how do we incorporate in the events for peace the actual process of peace, the very difficult process of peace and conflict?
Yeah, it absolutely is relevant. I mean, the key is being relevant in people's lives, and also expanding the range of peace. I mean, I think we need to be able to expand the range of peace, again, to look at peace from the inner to international. And then also, it's really about focusing on how it's transforming the situation to a higher possibility. I think restorative justice is an incredible example of this. I mean, the prison system today is just not working. It's completely failed us. There's more people in prison in the United States than any other country in the world. It's disproportionate racially and so forth. And so this is an example where restorative justice is creating an alternative. And this is a Gandhian idea. It's like first you do the deep inner work. The second is you do constructive projects that undermine the status quo of what's not working. And then the last thing you do is nonviolent protesting. You don't jump to that place. And so I feel like restorative justice, I mean, my friend Molly's mother was misdiagnosed, mental illness, and committed a horrendous crime where she's in prison for 20 years now. And Molly has been working with restorative justice, and it's rising up around the world. So I think in that gets into communities, it's relevant, it gets into neighborhoods, it gets into people's lives. So I think the key is to really, just educate. Again, what are all the different ways that are manifesting? Because there's so much manifesting. Nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, I saw that he was one of the speakers here. And then each of us just find and educate ourselves and then start to apply. And then it starts to really bridge the deep spiritual with the application, because as we do any of these practices, we will see the wisdom of all the different spiritual traditions. Restorative justice is based, a lot of it is based on indigenous wisdom and practices. And so we can see that wisdom rising up there. And to me, all of this, it's not airy-fairy, it's not Pollyanna, it's grounded and practical. I mean, Jamira Burley's brother was shot dead in his bed. And she's now in Philadelphia, working with the mayor of Philadelphia on innovative ways where young people can reduce violence. So I think, you know, for all of us, it's really being willing to learn as much as we can from one another and then look for the opportunities to engage and take action while continuing the spiritual practice. One question here came up is, you know, I could be so busy with my business and financial security, I don't have time for my meditation practice. Someone asked Gandhi, how do you have time to meditate? He says, well, the busier I am, the more I meditate. And I find this true because when getting busy, it's easy to get spun out and thinking I'm the doer and I got to get this done and get frantic. Whereas when I get drop in and realize I'm not the doer, and then I can start offering what I'm doing in service to the divine and say whatever the fruits are, they're yours, then there's a level of synchronicity that starts to happen. There's a level of motion that starts to happen. There's a range of possibilities that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And then in that sense, so to me, that's a daily practice. And believe me, I stumble on this all the time. And it's a daily practice. And so that's where I think as interfaith community is to really look at what are the practices we can offer our congregations to really tap into deep inner peace. And when going into meditation, the first sign of starting to contact the soul or essence is a negative peace. And the next sign is a positive peace. And that positive peace opens up to a bliss and even a joy and ecstasy, which is really the essence of our being.
How does being or becoming inform doing, and then doing then inform being and becoming?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, it's interesting. We all have affirmations running through our heads all the time, whatever our thoughts are. And by going deeper into, those affirmations are connected with the universal field of consciousness. So when our thoughts are in a certain frequency, we tune in to that frequency, and then we become channels for that frequency of consciousness. And so by going deeper into a practice, we start to tune in with other aspects besides our fears and our minds running in circles. So when we go into a practice, we start to tap into wisdom. And we start to tap into wisdom about how to be compassionate. And then that consciousness will express itself through us. And so it's that being will flow through and guide our actions. I talk about this Mickey Singer, this yogi who, you know, challenged me, like, who asked you how it could be? And then later he started to try to teach me to follow the energy. And he had a company when I met him of 15 to 20 employees. When I went back to him, crashed and burned, because I thought I knew what was going on, he said I had to get blown out of that seat with dynamite. He drove me around his office building, which had 1,000 employees, and he said he didn't do any of it. All he did was follow the energy. When Shakti told him to go left, he went left. When Shakti said go right, he went right. And then he said that could be gone someday and it wouldn't matter. And sure enough, the FBI came in, said he was under investigation. He was no longer the CEO of this company. He went back to his spiritual center and he wrote a book, The Untethered Soul, which became a bestseller, and then he was on Oprah, and he was found innocent. He followed the energy. And so that's a science that I'm striving to get better and better at, is how can I be in such a place of communion, practicing the presence of God 24/7, where that is what's leading me. The other aspect, being is doing in the sense of presence. Scientific research, Dean Radin, is proving that our thoughts are entangled. Our thoughts are being all around the room. Yogis will say thoughts are universal, that we only, there are no creative thoughts, that we choose which ones we're going to entertain. So all of our thoughts in this room are permeating. When a person is in deep peace, it radiates. When a person is in a really foul mood, it radiates. And so that's where inner peace is a global responsibility. It starts right with us. If we do our daily practice and we bring that presence of peace, and granted, we all get triggered. We all have the ego being worked and polished all the time. And if we go into that, aware of that, when we're being triggered and we're being polished, it's really the hand of the divine that's polishing us, bringing us deeper. It can be a really profound transformation.
In our community, we're having a tendency to face off one part of it against another. The sleep people and supporters of the sleep people and the other. And we're facing off as us and the other,
Sure.
both ways.
Sure.
And how do we build a bridge beyond that to see each other in our humanity?
First of all, I just want to acknowledge the mindfulness that I've witnessed since being with David about the care of people sleeping on the street, and it just seems like there's quite a bit of activity going on already. I think each of us carrying the daily practice into the interactions and being aware of when we start to demonize or perceive the other. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is that there's so many resources available today, and to draw upon those resources. And I think David is a great resource with contacting Michael Nagler at the Meta Center for Nonviolence. I consult Michael regularly. Michael, he's been working in nonviolence for 45 years. I started a program at Berkeley, and so it's just to tap on the resources and say, okay, Michael, here's the situation in Eugene. How can we approach this by drawing upon the wisdom of Gandhi? And it's a real sophisticated science that Gandhi had. It's not something that's just to dabble in. And so that's what I would do if I was in this situation. I would be on the phone to Michael and say, hey, Michael, can we Skype? Can we talk about this? He's really accessible. So that's the one thing that I would do. The other thing is again, just to be aware of the human tendency to polarize. And because basically we're living in a universe that's composed of duality. And if you look into Gita, they go into detail about, the different energies, and it's basically positive and negative, the dynamic between. And so there's a tendency to go towards polarity and duality. And if we can hold that in the awareness, and then also listen to the other side, really deeply listen. And listen as if they really matter and you see their humanity, and then also listen to try to listen to their truth. Because oftentimes when we get into polarized positions, we focus on the positions and what we're going to say in response. We're not really listening. Generally, what's underneath, and Barry, who's a mediator, will know, I'm sure he works with this, underneath positions are needs, unmet needs. And when we start to look at the needs, we start to see it's like two trees. The trunks can be the positions, the roots can be the needs, and the roots can overlap. And so it's really having the patience and the humanity to respect the other and asking why, getting to the underlying needs, and then bringing in the sophisticated work of like Gandhi through people like Michael Nagler, who's readily available to help. And then to slowly go through that process.
Right. Let's thank Phillip.